Good evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Bridey Gordon, and tonight I'm so thrilled to be chatting to the wonderful Laura Bates about Men Who Hate Women, her new book, which is the Hay Festival's Book of the Month for September. Limited signed copies are available for purchase on the Hay Festival website, or you can buy them from your local bookseller. Now, I want you to ask questions throughout the session. You can submit them in the questions tab on the Crowdcast and vote for your favourites, and they will be then be sent to me. And in the last 20 to 15 minutes, I'm going to ask them to Laura. Laura, are you there?
I'm here, yes.
We're kind of getting used to this, aren't we?
We are, yeah. We'll get into it.
Right. Laura, it's always amazing and a joy to be chatting to you. Although I feel like saying words like joy are not quite right, because once again you have written a book that is so important that last night I was up till 2 a.m. finishing it and reading it, and my feeling at the end, apart from being very tired because it was 2 a.m, was that I wanted this book to be pressed into the hands of every boy and girl in the country. Because it's so important. And as a 40-year-old woman, I was shocked that I didn't know so much in it. Will you tell us about the book?
Yes, absolutely. I think for me, that really sums it up. I was shocked that nobody knew either. And I wrote the book because it hadn't been written, I think. And I was increasingly aware that this phenomenon was happening. We were at a really positive moment globally where, thanks to the enormous courage and hard work of millions of survivors, we were suddenly having this conversation about violence against women, about workplace sexual harassment, about sexual violence, but we still weren't comfortable talking about perpetrators, really, about the idea of men actively committing these crimes. We still talk about women being raped, not about men committing rape. And the more I realized that there was a real extremist hate group, a terrorist group of men actively organizing, promoting and inciting this kind of violence, the more I also learned that nobody seemed to know it even existed. And I started to feel almost like I was going mad, that this thing was happening, that women were dying, and nobody knew it existed. As I was researching the book, I came across people who, when they asked me what I was writing about, and I mentioned the word incels, they asked me if it was a kind of battery or why I'd switched fields to microbiology. And then for me, the real tipping point was in schools where I work extensively, suddenly hearing the material that I was researching in these very extremist parts of the internet coming out of the mouths of teenage boys across the country, from rural Scotland to inner city London, hearing boys repeating the same completely false statistics about how actually 98% of rape allegations are false, or how men are far more likely to experience domestic abuse than women, how the gender pay gap is a feminist conspiracy, how at the height of our government there's a gynocracy, a feminist secret cabal and a conspiracy to undermine and take away the jobs of thousands of white men, how boys are at risk. And suddenly they started quoting the same exact words and phrases, and they were extremely obsessive about it. It was radicalization, but we don't call it that. If it had been any other group, you'd have looked at this group of people I was interacting with and said they'd been groomed. But nobody was aware that this was happening. It was off teachers' radars. Parents didn't know it was going on. And I started to realize that these real extremist groups were having much more of an impact offline than we'd like to think. So I thought we needed to start a conversation, because we can't tackle something like this if nobody knows it even exists.
Did you imagine that when you started the Everyday Sexism Project, that these years later you would be having to investigate something like this? Because that, as you said, it felt like we were at a turning point, a positive moment, and yet here we are. I mean, the figures that you quote in the book about the numbers involved in these incel communities, but also the other stuff that is perhaps seen as more kind of acceptable, like pickup artists and the rest of it. Can you talk us through the different groups that you've investigated in the book?
Absolutely. I don't think I could have imagined this. I think I let myself think that we were moving in a really positive direction. In the years since the Everyday Sexism Project began in 2012, it felt like we were making progress, like there was a huge and positive feminist movement internationally, that people were starting to talk about these issues, that great work was being done, and we were generally moving in the right direction. It wasn't until I started researching these groups that I recognized the sheer extent of the backlash and of the problem that remains. I thought, and anybody who has any kind of passing familiarity with these groups thinks that we're talking about a very small group of very extreme, nasty people. And it's understandable why you'd think that, because when you hear about them, it is so extreme, it's almost difficult to believe. You start, or I started with incels. We're talking about something, if we sort of start at the very beginning, which is collectively known as the manosphere, which is a rather frustratingly sort of trite and belittling word for it. But that is the name it has when it's talked about at all, which is rarely. And the manosphere is a group of complex, a kind of ecosystem, if you like, of interconnected movements and groups. They consist of forums, of social media, membership groups, of platforms, of Facebook groups, of vloggers, of individual websites, of online communities. It really is very much a sprawling web that you have to kind of unpick and work out the connections. But to give you an overview of some of the major communities in there, the first and perhaps most extreme is incels. Incel stands for involuntarily celibate. So these are men, in short, who aren't having sex and believe that as men in our society, they are owed sex, that it's their birthright, that the way to be an alpha male is to dominate women sexually. And they blame women very specifically and vitriolically for denying them sex. They believe that all women should be punished for this. Some of them believe that women should be kept as sex slaves. Some of them believe that there should be a government mandated redistribution of sex where men are allocated sex and women are a completely dehumanized resource. They really dehumanize women to an extreme degree. You'll find them having long debates about whether or not women are human or not. They tend to believe almost universally in taking away all of women's rights, in women being very much objects passed to men for their sexual gratification. And they are furious that women aren't having sex with them, to the extent that they believe in a day of retribution or a great kind of reckoning where incels around the world will rise up and murder women in retribution for the fact that they haven't slept with them. At no point do they stop and go, perhaps the fact that we murderously detest women and think of them as evil objects might have something to do with the fact that we're not having any sex. And it's very easy, I think, to laugh at this, to dismiss it, to say this sounds ridiculous. But in fact, if you look at the evidence, again and again and again, these men have come offline and massacred women. We just haven't heard about it.
Well, this is the thing in your book very early on, the list of acts of terrorism, essentially, against women that I felt shocked as a reasonably well-read woman. Mm-hmm. I didn't know about. I couldn't believe it. You were listing people walking into hot yoga sessions and shooting dead women, massage parlors. The one that all the incels seem to lionize is Elliot Rogers. Could you, talk us through? I think we really need to hear these statistics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so to give you a few examples, in August 2009, George Sedini entered a women's aerobics class, a hot yoga class, and shot 12 people, killing 3, leaving notes behind at the scene saying that he was frustrated with women, and online blogs saying that he did this because women hadn't chosen to sleep with him. In 2014, you have the case of Elliot Rogers in Santa Barbara, who targeted a sorority house and left behind a manifesto very clearly saying that he was going to enter the hottest sorority house and slaughter every single spoiled, stuck-up blonde slut I see who have rejected me. He killed 6 people and injured 14. In 2014, in a case that it seems very clearly might have been linked to that, but was never linked by the authorities or the media in any evidence I've been able to find, here in the UK, a teenager called Ben Moynihan went on a month-long stabbing spree in which he attempted to murder 3 different women in Portsmouth. He left a diary that said, "I was planning to murder women as an act of revenge because I'm still a virgin. I attack women because I believe that they're a weaker part of the human breed." Then in 2018, you have the case of Alec Manassian, who drove a rental van into pedestrians in Toronto, killing 10 people and injuring 16, mainly women, after writing online, "The Incel rebellion has already begun." In 2020, earlier this year, a 17-year-old boy took a machete into a massage parlor in Canada and slaughtered a woman very specifically in the name of incel ideology. These are just a few examples. In the book, I've traced this ideology of these extremist male supremacist groups to the murder or serious injury of over 100 people in the last 10 years alone. So it's mind-blowing, really, that these, as you say, they meet every international definition of terrorist acts. They are people going out, slaughtering women specifically because of a hatred of that particular group. And they are doing it to instill fear, to claim power, everything that you like in terms of ticking the boxes of this is terrorism. But explicitly, the police have come out after these attacks, after the Toronto van attack, for example, and given statements to the media saying the city is safe and there is no indication that this was related to terrorism. Again and again, you have headlines about these killing sprees that talk about these lone wolves, or about, you know, these poor men who must have been bullied in the past or must have some kind of problems. And nobody knows that this is a concerted, deliberate ideology and that women are being slaughtered in its name.
And also the media sort of complicit in this in a way. When we talk about Elliot Rogers, I think he was, you know, he was just, we were allowed to hear about how he was mentally ill, and that was responsible for it. Or he was described as a Hunger Games director's son, but at no point does anywhere in the media is it pointed out that this was an incel.
Exactly. Even though he'd left behind something like a 13,000 word manifesto explicitly detailing his hatred of women. What's particularly worrying, I think, is when you look at the fact that this appears nowhere across counter-extremism documentation, organizations. I've looked at some of the international reports kind of examining governments' responses to hate movements, and they are tracking and focusing on things like animal rights extremists or people with extreme views on abortion. We even know recently it's been leaked that counter-terror police were looking at Extinction Rebellion. We know that Donald Trump has called Black Lives Matter activists terrorists. Our ideas of what constitutes terrorism have this terrifying skew because of the nature of the people who are in power. And yet this doesn't appear on the radar, not anywhere. And I would have conversations while I was researching the book with people really in high-level positions in counter-terrorism organizations. And when I said the word incel, there was often a pause on the other end of the phone, and they would ask me to repeat it or to spell it and say that they'd call me back. So it really isn't on the radar. It's not on the radar when it comes to preventing radicalization. We don't use the word radicalization to describe its effect on teenage boys, even though my research suggests that it is having a massive effect on many of them. But also, it's really important to say that we're not just talking about 100 deaths and injuries and therefore a relatively small number of men. We are talking here about forums. One of the biggest forums that attracts incels that I infiltrated when I was researching the book has 100,000 members. Two of the websites I looked at had nearly 20,000 members. They have millions of posts which have been viewed millions of times. So this is a much bigger phenomenon than I think anybody recognizes. And that's the most extreme end of it. You then come on to other groups. So you have groups like Men Going Their Own Way, who are a community of men, again, with tens of millions of views on their vlogs. They tend to be particularly active on YouTube, this particular group, with tens of thousands of members in their forums, who believe that women are so poisonous and dangerous that the only way for men to survive is to avoid them altogether. Have no relationships, have no contact with women in your life or even in the workplace. And again, it sounds so extreme and ridiculous that you think, well, it can't be having any offline impact, until you realize that their ideology has been so successfully smuggled, if you like, sort of into the mainstream, that 27% of American men recently surveyed said that they now will not have a one-to-one meeting on their own with a woman in the workplace, or that even Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States, won't have dinner alone with a woman other than his wife. So actually these ideas that sound bizarre and ridiculous are starting to leak out very cleverly into society. And that's what I think is really worrying, that we don't know where they're coming from and we don't recognize it happening. There is also pickup artists, which is a $100 million industry. And again, something that when it crops up at all, we tend to dismiss as a few lovable rogues. Think Joey and Friends or Barney Stinson in How I Met Your Mother. And yet actually, in almost any city in the world, pre-COVID-19, you could pay thousands of dollars on almost any given weekend as a man to be taught and trained how to sexually harass and in some cases assault women by gurus, by leaders in this $1 million industry who have themselves filmed themselves assaulting women and put it on the internet for people to copy, who've boasted about committing rape, who have argued that rape should be legalized on private property. And there are women who I found for the book who have traced their rapes back to pickup artistry websites. These are websites where young boys are going to ask nervous questions about making conversation with girls and being answered with rape it, or told every woman has a rape fantasy, you're just playing into it, or coached into overcoming what they call last minute resistance, which is the idea that women might change their mind just before having sex, but really they just want to be forced into it. The other group I looked at are men's rights activists, who are, if you like, the more respectable face of the manosphere. They have a veneer of respectability, which is granted by the fact that they talk about and pay lip service to very real issues affecting men. They talk about issues like the male mental health crisis, about support for war veterans, about workplace-related injury, and they then do absolutely nothing to tackle those issues, but spend huge amounts of time abusing women, attacking feminists, attempting to bring lawsuits to defund female sexual violence shelters. They're actually having a massive impact because they've caught the ear of policymakers around the world. They've had an impact, there's evidence to suggest, on policy and policymakers in the United States, in terms of education policy, particularly in Australia. Here in the UK, we have an MP who's on the Women and Equalities Committee who's spoken at men's rights conferences and said that, you know, women in the UK are far better treated by the justice system than men are. It is much more mainstream than we'd like to think. And the media gives it a great platform. So that's the more respectable end of it, if you like.
Well, but it is, you say, it is incredibly mainstream. And then I was going to ask you to read a bit of the book, which was at the very beginning, which I think is the most beautiful piece of writing about the ugliest subject there is. And it really brings in, and just listening to you speak there, I feel really actually quite sad and upset. And I realized when I was reading the book, I could see threads the whole way through my life of things that I had thought were my fault, that I didn't realize were, pickup artist techniques, to give gaslighting and making a woman feel insecure. And, it was eye-opening, Laura. Will you read that? Sorry, I've just gone off on my own tangent then. There's so much to unpick and we've only got like an hour. Could you read that bit that I asked you to at the beginning?
I no longer believe that depriving these groups of the oxygen of publicity is the best course of action, because we're kidding ourselves if we believe that they aren't superb propagandists already spreading their message like wildfire. And the spread of that message benefits from our careful silence, our choice to look away. So I don't think that they should be ignored. Not because those who spread hatred and sow division deserve a fair hearing, not to legitimize the rhetoric of extreme prejudice by suggesting it's one side of a valid debate, but because we cannot confront the real threat these groups pose unless we're prepared to look it directly in the eye. Because right now, these groups have dug their claws deep into teenage boys across the country, and parents can't fight for their sons if they don't even know the problem exists. Because allowing the manosphere to remain shrouded in shadows lends a different kind of legitimacy, that of the scrappy underdog outsider. It allows these groups to claim the mantle of righteous grievance, posing as alienated victims when exposure to the bright light of day proves their ringleaders to be anything but. So over the period of a year, I immersed myself in these communities to find out how all of this is happening and to expose a powerful hate-fueled force that is currently underestimated by the few who knew about it while remaining invisible to everybody else altogether. I wanted to lay bare the reality of a hate movement, the very existence of which we've completely failed to acknowledge, and ask what is attracting boys and men to this ideology? How does it spread? What will it take to fight it? Of course, it doesn't all look like terrorism, murder, violence, or even misogyny on the surface. It would be easier to catch it if it did. It has to be cleverer than that, because the only way it can become so wildly, phenomenally successful, the only way it can be so cleverly camouflaged as to be almost undetectable, is if its arteries creep outwards from that black heart of violent hate, wending their way through online pathways and webbing out across social media platforms, splitting and dividing into finer and finer capillaries, infiltrating chat rooms, reaching out through message boards, sniffing tentatively at the air and taking the leap out of the dank realms of the internet altogether, slithering offline, penetrating our pubs and sliding around street corners, twirling delicately up the wooden legs of kitchen tables, peeping into corridors of power, burrowing into institutions and workplaces, fanning out tendrils across talk shows and newsrooms, taking deeper and deeper root until they're part of the very fabric of our shared consciousness. Meaning that eventually, when the shoots sprout, the fruits bud, and the flowers bloom, their taste does not disgust us and their colours don't surprise us because they're familiar and known, even though their roots lurk in the very darkest depths and the same poison drips through the entire network of veins.
This is the bit in if we were actually at the Hay Festival, I would have stopped and applauded you. So I'm going to do that now. They're talking about the mainstream misogyny, and it's stuff that we will all know. But you've dug in a little bit deeper than that. We obviously, the sort of that incel ideology. You write about how Steve Bannon actually targeted incels during the 2016 presidential campaign as a core voter group. Could you talk a bit more about that? Because obviously I would say that a lot of mainstream politics and a lot of mainstream media is where those shoots and tendrils are now coming out.
Absolutely. So this is where it gets very slippery. You have evidence from Christopher Wiley, the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, that Steve Bannon deliberately courted the votes of incels in that election. What that tells you, I think, really powerfully, is that there are men in positions of power who are able to tread a very fine line in the way in which they refer obliquely to these ideas, in the way in which they throw out dog whistles, they sanitize and present a kind of almost respectable version of these ideologies, knowing full well that they will be picked up and responded to in the manosphere, and that the potential support, because of the sheer numbers of these men, is massive. But they do it through slippery intermediaries. There are men like Steve Bannon, there are men like Milo Yiannopoulos, there are men who are kind of one link up the chain but have that kind of relationship with these groups online. And then you've got somebody like Donald Trump or others like him who are able to kind of use those men as a sort of buffer to maintain plausible deniability. And yet when Donald Trump talks about sending congresswomen of color back to the countries they came from, or when he talks about Mexican men as rapists plundering white women, he is absolutely signaling those communities, and the corresponding boost that he gets, obviously, Steve Bannon felt was worth the kind of risk. But it's not just something that is worthwhile for politicians, although we're definitely seeing politicians flirting with these groups. It's also something that men like, for example, Jordan Peterson, academics, popular media figures are also able to get that corresponding boost of support from these communities, whilst couching what they say very carefully in rhetoric that definitely kind of signals to them, but that they can kind of maintain that veil of plausible deniability of, oh no, I'm just putting out this particular point. The ideology is kind of smuggled into plain sight, if you like, partly because these groups are platformed themselves by the mainstream media. A good example of this is a men's rights group called the Anti-Feminism League, which hosted on its websites articles like 13 Reasons Women Lie About Rape, which wanted to repeal the Equality Act, for example, as part of its manifesto. It realised that it wasn't getting a lot of airtime, and it rebranded itself as a political party, whereupon it immediately was given coverage across the national press. You name it, every major BBC politics, current affairs show, every regional BBC radio outlet, Sky News, the works. They were given huge airtime for their leader to say things like, we hear a lot about misogyny, but actually white men are the most disadvantaged group who are hated. Men are hated by our society. To talk about the fact that rape and domestic violence figures were false and that men were the real victims across the national press. And then you look at the results of the election, and this party got 216 votes between all its candidates. So the level of the media furore was completely out of proportion to the size of the political outfit. But for the media, there's a real benefit, I think, in portraying feminism as a big controversy between whining women who want to bang on about Kleenex man-sized tissues and, you know, justifiably angry men who are feeling hard done by. They don't want to talk about sexual violence and about the real issues. And so they play into it. You know, it's easier to be a teenage boy and be convinced by an online hate movement telling you that there's a crisis of false rape allegations, for example, if you've heard on the BBC's flagship Today programme, the presenter asking, but isn't Me Too really a witch hunt? You know, and that gives it that veil of plausibility. It makes it more acceptable. It shifts what these men are obsessed with, what they refer to as the Overton window of kind of acceptable public discourse, and it helps to create that slippery slope.
I mean, and you must listen. I'm aware that talking to you right now on an online platform is for you personally is something that is, you know, potentially quite dangerous. I mean, we can't see comments and all of that, but, you know, potentially there could be among the hundreds of people who have registered tonight to watch this, members of the Incel community. You have experienced terrible abuse, rape threats, death threats. Can you, and you know, and this was before this book was published. Can you tell us, I want to talk to you, I want to ask you a little bit about that. But then also about the effect of going into these communities, and you know, you posed as a boy called Alex, and the effect that being kind of you know, involved in these communities for a long, presumably very long periods of time has on your mental health.
Mm-hmm. And immersed in these communities which are massively celebrating and lionizing men for murdering women. They're sharing videos of women being killed and complaining that there isn't sound, so they can't hear the women screaming. They're commenting on a boy who murdered a woman who had rejected him and saying that they hope that he raped her first, so that she had pages and pages that happened to be about me personally. During my research, you know, I was doing research one day and suddenly was face to face with a kind of group fantasy of different people's ideas about raping me with pieces of furniture and giving me internal injuries and what kind of prolapse, how common these elements of it are. We are not just talking about a few cherry-picked posts. You know, obviously we're talking about a massive community of people, so this isn't to suggest that every one of them is a would-be rapist or is actually going offline and killing women, but it's also inaccurate to suggest that a few bad apples are being used to smear what's generally a sort of support group or a, you know, well-meaning community, as is sometimes argued. We are talking about sheer vitriol. I mean, about men where across millions of pages about women, you wouldn't see the word what expresses how little they believe that women are really human beings. You might hear women referred to as roasties, which is a sort of pejorative term which refers to women's genitalia being deformed by, as they perceive it, prey, separating the weakest gazelle from the pack, targeting a 2 out of 10 so that you can push that fat pig aside to get to the 8 out of 10 HB behind her. It's kind of hunting in various different ways. Women are just utterly dehumanized. So I think it was a shock. I thought I knew the worst of it and I didn't. And then just before the book came out and I was bracing myself, really knowing that this would be the worst it had ever been, there was a situation in the States where a member of very specific rights thing of bringing spurious cases against, trying to argue against the constitutionality of the Violence Against Women Act or attacking bars for having ladies' nights. He brought a case against the male-only military draft and was dissatisfied by its handling by a female judge. And about a month before the book was published, and too close to publication to include this incident in the book, he turned up at this woman's house and shot dead her son and shot her husband. So, you know, the backlash from these groups is real. They, since the book has come out, have been looking for me, targeting me, hacking my emails, trying to backtrace it. But I think I wasn't aware of just how many of them there were before this, and that's quite chilling.
I guess, you know, I could ask you why you do this, given this response, but I guess the response is the reason you do it, because to write these books and bring these issues to the front.
Well, I think I'm very lucky. You know, I'm incredibly lucky in the amount of support that I have, you know, public facing support and personally. You know, if somebody's going to talk about this, there are women of colour online, there are trans women online who are receiving triple the death and rape threats that I am because of their intersecting identities. You know, I'm in a relative feeding comet coming towards us. Literally, since I've written the book, there have been increasing cases of men planning this stuff. One man who was planning to carry out another incel attack who was only identified because the improvised explosive device that he'd made blew up in his own garden shed. And police found all of the messaging that he'd written about it. There's, you know, obviously this case of the woman being killed with a machete earlier this year, this woman's son being shot dead. It's happening and it's coming offline, and women are dying because of it, and people don't even know about it. And the people who are meant to protect us are really convinced by it and radicalised by it, and the people who are meant to protect them and support them don't know about it. So I think once you can see it, and you can see that meteorite speeding towards us and no one else seems to know it's there, you have to, right? I mean,
before we came online, we were talking about the response you've had, stuff the questions you had from parents, and obviously there may be people watching this right now who have sons or who are worried about loved ones who they think may have got involved in this, and how do they, bridge the look out for? There's language, isn't there, like blue pillars, red pillars, which is from the Matrix, isn't it? And yeah. Could you talk us through a few of those things?
Absolutely. I think the first thing I'd say is that I'm not trying to scare anyone or to sensationalize. I'm meeting lots of brilliant teenage boys in my school visits who are really interested in feminism and how they can support gender equality. This isn't to say that every boy is being affected by this, but I'm also not cherry picking just based on my own experiences. For the book, one of the people I interviewed most extensively was Ben Hurst, who's the chief facilitator of the Good Lad Initiative. And that's probably the biggest project. And when I asked him about it, he estimated that 70% of the boys he works within schools have come into contact with this material online. So I don't mean to say, first piece of advice to parents would be to try and familiarize yourself with the landscape of the young person in your life's online world. In this case, what that might look like isn't necessarily being a member of an incel forum, because that's not really how they're targeting boys. They're much more clever and savvy than that. They are very deliberately grooming boys where boys own console, but over his headphones, men around the world who he doesn't know and his parents don't even perhaps realize are whispering in his ear are, as one mum I interviewed put it, shouting feminism is cancer over her son's speakers as he played Fortnite. Or they're dropping small tidbits of sexism and racism and waiting to see who nibbles, and then moving it into a private game. And vulnerabilities and anxieties about a particular form of alpha male identity might be easy to recruit and to radicalize, to target boys as young as 11. They're using mainstream videos. So have a look, go onto YouTube and type in something like feminist gets destroyed and have a look at the kind of rabbit hole you get sucked into, or follow some of the biggest comedy meme accounts on Instagram, or look at one of the kind of big red pill communities on Reddit. Red pill is the term that they use to describe the moment that if you take the red pill, borrowed from The Matrix, ironically a brilliant movie by two trans women, but set that aside for a minute. Boys who've been exposed to this ideology might suddenly become very seemingly intolerant of other ideas and beliefs. They might use terms like based, like triggered, like normies, Chads, Stacys. They might be describing anybody as a something cell. It doesn't have to be an incel. It might be a height cell or a wrist cell or a bald cell or a rape cell. They might be spending increasing amounts of time online. Any of these are kind of try and engage them in conversation about it. Give them an opportunity to talk about it, because these people prey on their worst fears, and they prey on stigma and silence and taboo, and telling them that nobody else will understand them. So it doesn't work to try and shut them down by saying, you know, this is nonsense and you're completely wrong, because they've been told to expect that that's what the normies would say, because they've been brainwashed. So actually giving them the time and the space to talk about this, not to be judgmental, and helping them to learn about recognizing sources online, about not trusting everything they read, looking up statistics with them. You know, when the real statistics are that a man in the UK is 230 times more likely to be raped himself than falsely accused of rape. So the answers are there if you go looking for them together and give them the opportunity to find those answers. But I think it's really important for parents to be aware of the sheer power.
Okay, so on that note, you mentioned Reddit there as well. I mean, which is a huge social media community, mainstream. What are social media sites and companies doing to try and prevent this, if anything at all?
Very much not enough, in my opinion. There have been examples when these kinds of things have been pointed out to them and they haven't taken measures that have been suggested by researchers or by journalists, because they're concerned about the way in which it might affect their bottom line. A very good example of this, I think, is when it was pointed out to YouTube that its algorithm, and these algorithms obviously aren't set up to be racist and sexist and to perform these horrendous radicalizing things, but that doesn't mean they're not doing it. And YouTube is the perfect example of this. So, for example, YouTube's algorithm, horrifyingly, was recommending automatically similar content to men who were looking for videos and serving it up to paedophiles in a long string. And we only realized it was happening because families suddenly realized that their video of their 2-year-old in the paddling pool suddenly had 4 million hits within a few weeks. And when it was slip in the swimming costume or whatever it was suggested to YouTube that turning off the recommendation algorithm on videos of children would solve the problem, which they could have done automatically. And they chose not to, because it would make it social media platforms are aware of this. They aren't doing enough. And there tends to be a sense of, you know, this isn't in the design, we're not doing it on purpose. Well, of course you're not, but you still know it's there is absolutely evidence to suggest that YouTube specifically, which is the most popular social media platform among young people, which has an enormous amount of power. There are 1.5 billion YouTube users in the world. That's more than, they are one of the most powerful shapers of thought in the world, specifically for young people. If you look at the figures, YouTube accounts for 37% of all mobile internet traffic internationally. And 70% of videos on YouTube that are watched are what's recommended by the algorithm. 70% of what we're seeing on YouTube, YouTube has chosen what to serve us. Put those two figures together, and this one company, this private profit-making company, is responsible for a quarter of all power, and that kind of power over teenagers. And it's been repeatedly made clear by research and reports that there is an extensive network of influencers, of alt-right and extremist misogynists pulling boys down a rabbit hole. Then you have a responsibility to step up to the plate and to spend, if that's what it takes, some of your billions of dollars of profits on tackling.
From people watching tonight, thank you so much for submitting your questions. I'm going to sort of just go through them. They're all great. Zayda asks, what emotional, psychological, social reasons do you think cause such hate?
I'm so glad you've asked that. It's a great question. This is something I look at in depth in the book. I think that we are at the moment very good at talking about problems with masculinity, but not very good at necessarily conveying that message, but that is also toxic and damaging to men. But what people hear is toxic men. But actually what we're talking about, university level being made by boys and all the rest of it, that leads to a crisis and a tragedy for men, that the male, so clever, beguiling, seductive community of men waiting to weaponize them and to suck men in and to pretend that they care and to very attractively and appealingly say this society hates you. And for me, the biggest crisis is that we've seen swinging cuts to youth services, to youth workers, that 600 youth centres have been closed down. So that sense of belonging, of community, of wanting to find a way to feel a part of a cause, none of that's available anymore offline. And ironically, we need to tackle the areas and issues that the manosphere claims to pay lip service to caring about. Issues like shattering the stigma around male survivors of sexual violence, like supporting boys to smash the stereotypes, if we want to give solutions to these men, because the manosphere wants to suck them in. It wants, for example, but it doesn't actually want to help them, because it then doubles down on exactly the problems that have sent men to them broken in the first place. You need to be an alpha male. You need to go out and dominate women, rape them, kill them, want to take out its knees from under it.
Well, Claire asks, incel forums also discuss suicide regularly, with some participants encouraging others to kill themselves. And do you...
community, what little has been written about incels in the past tends either to portray them all as kind of misunderstood and vilified. For me, I think what's most volatile and toxic is the older men who might have faced very real personal problems in their lives coming into the orbit of these men who have the aim of wreaking as much havoc and pain on others as they can. And that's to tackle that mental health crisis, if we're going to look at how we provide alternative options to men who are very vulnerable, who are being pulled into this. But we also have to look at the gurus and the leaders of these websites who are very aware of what they're doing and who are absolutely, that's why the answer isn't a kind of blanket ban on every one of these websites or suggesting that all of these men are criminals. It has to be much.
He comes across as a genuinely articulate and persuasive advocate for both men and women. Surely he's a very different voice to debate with versus the ridiculous incel adolescents. I naturally support and applaud your efforts to cast light on these horrifically
of where this gets very complicated, and I would urge you to read the book, because it's difficult to say now in the amount of time that we've had, the complexity. But essentially what I'd say is that Jordan Peterson is very much venerated by these men. So these red pill and online forums absolutely adore and applaud him. They are a portion of his online accolades. Not to say for a second that he's necessarily even aware of these communities or is deliberately in any way courting them. He, I'm sure, would suggest that he is actually actively fighting against this kind of idea. But he also has very effectively spread a deeply misogynistic version of it. So this is the man who was getting $80,000 a month from, because he can monetize the outrage around offending, who represents a very different voice in terms of kind of edging some of these ideas into the mainstream. And again, it's complicated. So it's not to suggest that he isn't some logic in this kind of language in the way in which he couches his ideology. That doesn't mean that he's an incel or that he's directly related to these forums in any way. It is murky and complicated.
But there are, I mean, one of the interesting things about the book is the things that you write about, where you write about how desensitized you became while being immersed in these cultures, and how desensitized so many of us are to this misogyny. You know, that one of the fascinating things you wrote about a journalist called Bridey Lee Kennedy, who. Yeah. And her experience. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And you know, because she quit journalism essentially because of the online trolling, which we are, you know, as professionals, women, we are expected to just deal with, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and she's a good example as well of where the media has some accountability, because she was asked to write an article about men's rights activists and about incels, and she wrote a quite light-hearted piece, but her editors changed the title to something like "Let's all have a laugh at the men's rights community," and it attracted an enormous online pile-on of abuse. And she describes how even as she was experiencing the most horrific abuse about killing her unborn child, really horrific stuff, her editors were watching the clicks pile up and going, this is brilliant, people really hate you. So it's a really good example, I think, of where it's something that people people like men in the media and media outlets themselves benefit from lucratively from paying lip service to these kinds of communities, from saying things that absolutely may not have anything to do with them, and it may be a total coincidence that they resonate so deeply, but resonate they do, and they pick up on the outrage, and they kind of, it's a sort of vicious circle, and it works very well for media outlets as well. And she ended up eventually quitting her job altogether. She couldn't write online anymore because the extent of the abuse had become so bad, and it had affected her so badly.
And that abuse is still there to be read on the Mail online. Those comments haven't been deleted. It's there on a national newspaper's website. So an interesting question from Amanda. Do you think men could write a similar or different book about us? Is there any female equivalent?
Well, it's really interesting that you should say that. And there's a very good answer to this, I think, which is that a book was written called Why Women Should Hate Men, or Why I Hate Men, or something, in France.
Recently.
It came out almost exactly to the day when my book came out. And it has received international press attention. Member of the French Parliament called for it to be banned because it was inciting hatred against men. It's received a huge amount of attention and press and propaganda, and the argument has been very much that, you know, this is two-sided. Women hate men just as much. Here's an example of it. This book. So this book had a print run of 1,500 copies. And I think it's kind of extraordinary that it has been called upon by a politician for it to be banned, for it to be investigated, for it to be tackled, when the communities I'm investigating are hundreds of thousands of men strong. They have literally millions of viewers and acolytes and hangers-on and people around these communities. They have killed or seriously injured over 100 women. They are impacting and potentially affecting God knows how many other thousands of women's lives, in the form of women who, for example, might have been raped by somebody who's been trained on a pickup artist website, and they will never hit the headlines. And to my knowledge, there isn't a politician anywhere standing up and saying this should be banned. This is something that we need to be tackling. In fact, I wrote this book because nobody seems to know that they exist. So yes, of course, you could write a book about individual women who have been hateful towards men or hold hateful views. But is there a corresponding movement of this size and extremity causing this number of killings and murders? You know, to the extent that obviously at a wider level, you've got over 2 women a week being killed by a current or former partner. 1 in 3 women on the planet will be raped or beaten at some point in her lifetime. No, there isn't a corresponding systemic problem.
Thank you, Laura. I that's very important to say. And again, it's like the argument you have, you know, as you pointed out, more men will be will experience sexual assault than be accused falsely of it. These are these things that get pulled out of all proportion, don't they? I mean, the question, I get, we're running out of time, unfortunately, but I think we'll end with this question from Vivian, which is, how can we individually or collectively counter this toxic culture? What can we do?
That's a really great question. Thank you. The first thing I think is that we need to recognize it for what it is. We need to look it in the eye and we need to see it. And that means recognizing its complexity, recognizing the vulnerability of the victims who've been drawn into it, as well as the perpetrators who are weaponizing it. It means, crucially, recognizing its overlap with white supremacy and the alt-right, recognizing the racism inherent within this movement, and recognizing the misogyny at the absolute foundations of those movements. You know, it is so common for white supremacists and neo-Nazis to be obsessed with what they call birth rates or replacement theory. They have this idea that they need to create a supreme white master race. They have this idea that the precious dehumanized commodity of white women is being plundered by non-white invading men. They have this idea that white women should be kept as sex slaves, that black women should be forcibly sterilized or forced to have abortions. It is all tied up in in misogyny. And the incel movement is desperately racist. They're not just angry women aren't having sex with them, but that women are having sex with non-white men. So we have to see this as part of a much bigger problem with forms of terrorism that historically we have never used that label for. We need to see it systemically being seen as such by counter-terror organizations and governments. We need to encourage schools to be funded and trained to properly support young people who are being groomed and radicalized. Make no mistake, that's what's happening. As individuals, I think we need to look this in the eye and be prepared to see it for what it is. And that's why I wrote the book, in the hope that people would be prepared to lift the lid on this world and recognize that it's there and that it exists. For those of us with young people in our lives, we need to be prepared to have difficult conversations with them, and not just one long difficult conversation, but many, many smaller conversations. If we have young people in our lives who are at school, we can encourage them to seek out this stuff with young men who look like them, rather than with, thinking that women are coming in to hector them or lecture them or anything like that. And every one of us, I think, can also play a role in terms of the society that we live in and the way in which it's laid the foundation for this. Because if we're talking about radicalization and extremism, all of the expert organizations that exist to extract people and to de-radicalize them, none of which, as far as I've been able to find, deal with any of these particular forms of misogynistic radicalization, but all of them focus on the idea of breaking the idea of that other person being so othered and dehumanized and made to seem so extreme that you're able to absolutely detest them. So a good example of this is Christian Piccolini, who runs an organization, I think it's called the Free Radicals, and he took a white supremacist neo-Nazi and introduced him to an imam, and they became fast friends. And just realizing that this person, that this Muslim that he had been taught to believe was some kind of evil monster, was a human being, was what helped that person out of radicalization. And when I talk about that in terms of this form of radicalization, people say, but young people are at school together, boys and girls are mixing, that othering doesn't happen. But I was recently on a round table talking about education and sexism next to a young teacher, a young Muslim teacher, and she said, if the children in my classroom of 6 and 7 segregated themselves at lunchtime by race or religion, the school would consider it an emergency and take action. But every day in my class, the young people line up on opposite sides of the room and the boys and the girls separate themselves. And by 8 or 9, they're not inviting boys or girls to their birthday parties because they're getting the pink princess invitations and you're not sending those to boys, because it's normalized and encouraged that you'll like different things and have different interests, and of course you'll play in those different groupings, to the extent that young people don't really know each other. We sexualize them from such a young age that a 2-year-old sits down next to another 2-year-old at a toddler group and people go, oh, they're on their first date, he's going to be a charmer, lock up your daughters. And so actually young people don't know each other. So I would say my last piece of advice, as distant as it might seem from what we're describing tonight, is to smash those gender stereotypes and to encourage young people to play and to know each other and to have meaningful friendships with people of all genders, and not to force those ideas that they are separate and distanced on them from such a young age, because it plays right into the hands of the men online who will later tell them that these women are voids and they're below humanity, and that actually raping them is something that does them a service.
Laura, you are one of the most remarkable, brilliant, incredible human beings. I want to thank you to everyone who's come tonight and asked questions and just been here. Thank you to everyone who's donated to the festival's Future Fund when registering for this event. You can continue to support the Hay Festival by donating over on the website. Our book of the month for October is Pandora's Jar by Natalie Haynes, and registration for that session is now live on the Hay Festival website and Crowdcast. And if you enjoy this event, you can sign up to the festival's full archive of events for just £10 a year on Hay Player, and sign up to the festival's monthly newsletter to hear about upcoming sessions. But finally, I want her up on the screen next to me. Laura, I'm going to get myself off the screen. There we go. Men Who Hate Women, Laura Bates. It's the most fantastic, important, brilliant book. And I hope it gets as much attention as that book by the French academic about why she hates men. You're a fantastic woman, Laura. Thank you, Hay, for having us. I wish we could be there together and hugging and we could continue this conversation for hours, but hopefully next year we can be face to face at the actual festival.